Hey everyone, and welcome to this quick guide for tuning in Gran Turismo 7. This video is meant to be more of a primer to help you get comfortable with the admittedly daunting tuning system and to understand, at least at a basic level, what each adjustment can do to your car. Tuning is ultimately fairly complicated, nuanced, and personal to some degree. Every car behaves and reacts differently to tuning, so the best thing you can do is make small adjustments at a time and test on a track you're already familiar with. Alright, let's start with just a basic overview of this whole window, because although it might look scary, there's actually not too much going on here. The left third of the screen is simply dedicated to showing your car's stats. If you make a tuning adjustment or swap out a part, you can hit triangle to remeasure and update this stat sheet. Changes, good or bad, will be shown in blue. We'll come back to this throughout the video, but for now, let's move over to the right side of the screen where all the action happens. Most of this area is just for swapping parts. You can see here on the right side that all of this is just for swapping out different upgrades, and as such doesn't really need to be considered when tuning. At the top of the page, we can make new tuning sheets, which is super helpful for managing setups for different circuits or race restrictions, or being able to experiment on a new sheet without messing up a known good tune. So for tuning, really all you need to worry about is this area here. And keep in mind that some of these options will be locked unless you install the corresponding mod on your car. Alright, let's dive into suspension tuning, starting with body height. The general rule here is to get the car as low as possible without ever bottoming out. A lower car will have a lower center of gravity, and as such will shift less weight during cornering and braking, leading to more grip and stability. Too low though and you'll bottom out, or even prevent the wheel from being able to turn fully within the wheel arch. This usually shows itself in the form of extreme understeer. Trial Mountain is a great place to test your car's height. Take a look at this GTR cornering with a good body height first. And now the same car with the height set too low. Look at how the steering indicator dot doesn't even move all the way to the left. This is most likely because my wheels are hitting the wheel arch. I think it's clear to see how important it is to set a good body height. Let's move on to anti-roll bars. Now for ARBs, damping, and natural frequency, the general rule is that a lower or softer front value will lead to more oversteer, and a lower rear value will lead to understeer. However, each of these settings adjusts that balance in slightly different ways. For your ARBs, focus on an overall stiffness first, then adjust the front to rear balance. Stiffer bars will lead to less overall body roll. Too stiff will restrict suspension movement though and could reduce grip. You'll also notice the car behaves worse over things like curbs. Now for damping, this adjusts how your car responds to bumps and transitions and can be adjusted in two ways, the compression and expansion ratio. Softer damping will allow quicker and more free suspension movement, absorbing bumps more easily, but leading to a slower steering response and an overall more sloppy feeling car. If you stiffen the damping, the opposite becomes true. The car will feel snappy, rigid, and responsive, but could be more skittish over bumps and curbs. Damping can be quite track dependent and also very driver dependent. It's all about finding the right balance for you. Natural frequency is your car's spring rate, or the overall stiffness of the springs. You want to reduce body roll without over-stiffening the car. Some suspension movement is good. Like with ARBs, I find it best to start neutral and find an overall spring rate, then dial in the front to rear balance. If you lower your car, you may need a stiffer spring rate to compensate and prevent bottoming out. You'll also want to run stiffer springs on better tires. Natural frequency, body height, and tire compound all play off each other significantly, so make sure you take them all into consideration at the same time. Let's move on to camber and toe. Camber adjusts how much of your tire can make contact with the road during a corner. All cars should have at least some negative camber. A good camber value can take some trial and error to dial in, but I like to describe it as if your car feels like it locks in to a corner. If you're oversteering too much, try adjusting rear camber. Understeering, try front camber. Now, toe should be used sparingly. Front toe should generally only be adjusted out, and rear toe should only be adjusted in. Any toe value at all will cause more tire heat and wear, and potentially affect top speed. However, some front toe out can greatly improve cornering ability, especially on turn-in. Rear toe in can help keep your car stable at speed, or more importantly, keep you from oversteering out of a corner once you start getting back on power. That doesn't really apply to front-wheel drive builds though. Start with a neutral or default toe, and only adjust this once you've dialed in the rest of your setup. And that's it for suspension. Let's move on to differential tuning. Your differential affects how much power goes to each wheel, and will play a large role in your corner exits, but does affect other things as well. Initial torque, or preload, for example, plays a large role throughout the whole corner, and in simple terms is the default setting for how much your differential locks the left and right wheels together. A higher value will feel more stable and consistent during a corner, and potentially give more grip in aggressive driving situations, but can lead to heavy understeer and low cornering ability, especially in tighter turns. Start with a low setting, but if you notice too much instability or grip loss when going on or off throttle while cornering, bring the value up to closer match your acceleration sensitivity. Now, acceleration sensitivity affects the amount of locking under acceleration. Higher values will distribute your torque more evenly between the left and right wheels. In rear-wheel drive, or for the rear diff in all-wheel drive, a higher value will cause more on-power oversteer and can increase your corner exit speed. In front-wheel drive cars, or the front diff in all-wheel drive, this will be a bit more tricky to dial in based on feel. With a low diff setting, your inside tire will spin while on power. As you increase the diff lock, the outside tire will instead start to spin. Your optimal setting is usually right around where that transition happens. This is technically also true for a rear diff, but it's a lot easier to just set the rear diff by corner exit feel. For the front diff, you can get technical or look at replays, or just adjust in increments until you get good corner exit speed without excessive understeer. Alright, now finally, you may have torque vectoring in all-wheel drive. This simply adjusts how much power gets sent to the front or rear wheels. The left value being front, right is rear. A higher rear balance will lead to more oversteer, higher front, more understeer. Alright, we're done with the hard stuff. Let's move over to the right side here and look at downforce. Generally speaking, more downforce gives more grip and cornering ability at speed, while also putting more load on the suspension, increasing tire heat, and reducing top speed and high speed acceleration. A higher front value will give more front tire grip and help a lot with turn-in, and a higher rear value will of course give more rear tire grip and help with stability, as well as some corner exit grip in rear or all-wheel drive. Downforce can be very track dependent, and a technical, more low-speed track can benefit greatly from higher downforce setups. On high-speed tracks, a lower value will help maintain speed. Make sure you consider body height and the spring's natural frequency when adjusting downforce. For example, if you have a high rear downforce setting, it may be smart to introduce some rake by raising the rear end. This means that at speed, when downforce is pressing your rear end down, it doesn't sag below the front, which can cause all sorts of aerodynamics issues. An alternative to rake would be increasing rear natural frequency, so more downforce is required to compress the suspension. Alright, now we're going to skip over ECU and performance adjustment here and touch on that quick at the end of the video. It's very important though, so don't skip that. Let's talk transmissions. Tuning these can be pretty much as simple or as complicated as you want to make it, and can be very track dependent. Start by finding the track you want to test on. Longer gears will increase top speed at the expense of potentially lower acceleration. Simply, you just want to make sure you aren't hitting the top of your last gear anywhere on the track. If you are, bump up top speed a notch or two and test again. Some cars might have too much downforce or not enough power to reach the top of their last gear. In this case, you can and should generally tune top speed so that you still hit the high end of your last gear on very long straights. Transmission tuning can be left at that, just making sure you get close but don't hit the top of your last gear. If you want though, you can get much more involved and track specific with it. For example, you may notice you have some awkward corners that are maybe too fast for second gear but too slow for third. You could fix this by shortening third gear to make sure you're in your power band coming out of the corner. Or you may have a section that's just long enough to shift into fifth, but only for a second before having to brake and downshift. So in order to not lose time on that shift, you could lengthen 4th gear a bit so that you don't top out 4th and have to shift before having to corner. Again, this is a much more involved process, and I honestly wouldn't worry about it unless you're really pushing for that competitive edge. Finally, we come to Nitrous. This one is pretty simple. A higher output percentage means you'll get a bigger power boost, but burn through your bottle quicker. This is, of course, very track and lap count dependent, as well as depending on how you personally use it. Some save it for the big straights and use high boost, whereas others use a lower output but burn nitrous coming out of most corners or even on small straights. This one is totally up to you, but ultimately, you just want to make sure you have enough to last you the whole race without any extra. Alright, and those are the main adjustments covered during tuning. Now let's take a quick look at ballast and power restriction, because this can be massively important, and knowing how to adjust it can shave seconds off your lap time. So it's recommended when trying to fit into a certain weight to overshoot that restriction and then dial it back with ballast. The reason is simple. You can place the ballast wherever you want, and by doing so, you have control over the weight balance of the car. If, for example, your FR car is too front heavy or feels light in the rear, overdo the weight reduction, then put your ballast in the rear. A balanced 50-50 weight distribution is often a good goal to shoot for, or at least a good starting point, but I often find myself adjusting outside of that to help dial in some over or understeer. This adjustment will be very car dependent. Just keep in mind that added weight should be compensated for with stiffer springs. And if you are going to adjust your weight balance, you may want to adjust brake balance as well. This setting allows you to adjust your car's balance coming into a corner, but it's also key for races with tire wear. If your front tires are wearing out well before your rears, it's time to move some balance rearward. Just keep in mind that this will cause some more oversteer and instability during braking on corner entry. Now for power limiting, a similar methodology is true. It can be helpful to overshoot power goals a bit and then dial them back with the restrictor. And this is huge, the ECU will not adjust your power band, the power restrictor will. Let's take a look at the Tom's Supra here. I'm going to adjust ECU output down to about 600 horsepower, and now look at my torque, just about 500. Now let's bring the ECU back up and instead use the restrictor to bring horsepower down to 600. Now, my torque is 560. So either way, I'd fit under a 600 horsepower race restriction, but with the restrictor instead of the ECU, I've got 60 more foot-pounds of torque to work with. This applies to upgrades as well. If you fit upgrades that promote more low-end torque, you can get away with a lot more. Let's switch the high RPM turbo for a medium RPM, and again, bring power down to 600 with the restrictor. Here, we've got a torque value of 627, a whopping 127 more foot-pounds of torque over the high RPM turbo with ECU adjustment, with the same peak horsepower. So this is all to say, don't just hit your horsepower restriction and call it a day. Your overall power band and torque output plays a big role. I'm talking multiple seconds off lap times. So if you really want to min-max, it's worth it to buy up a variety of parts and try to find the right mix in tuning that gives you a strong power band and good torque output while still fitting under any horsepower restriction. Now finally, to wrap this video up, remember when tuning to only make small adjustments at a time. Don't change 5 things at once before retesting your tune, because you may have improved 3 things but made 2 others worse, and you won't know which is which. Also, every car and every driver is different. Although there are general guidelines to follow, what works for one car may not work for another. Never get too set in your ways, always be open to experiment. And different drivers with different driving styles will prefer different setups. So make sure you don't just copy and paste, find out what works for you. And guys, that's gonna do it. I hope this video was short and concise enough to not overwhelm, while still giving you the info you need to get started with tuning. It can be frustrating at first, but I hope this gives you a solid head start so you can get out there and get fast. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.